says.
That's good. Good news.
Larry and Joy Lindsay needs our prayers.
Is he still up there? He's in Evansville, right?
Yes. And they haven't been able to do the surgery. So,
Larry Lindsay,
oh,
he had an aneurysm, and still has it, and they haven't been able to do the surgery to relieve it. Correct.
that's right. Also, some of you, well, I know Dolores and Mary did, but Jackie and Alice Romaine, who lived in Bandana at one time, their 58-year-old son died this week of Alzheimer's. Yeah. It was the baby.
Ricky?
Was it Ricky?
It was Ricky, I saw that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mhm.
I didn't realize it was Alzheimer's. Good.
Uh-huh.
58?
Mhm. And he had it for several years.
Early onset, they call it, and it's odd.
Then, I've got one more.
Here comes.
Chris and Susan. Susan had surgery on a leg this week and is having quite a bit of pain and problems. Chris got sick last night all of a sudden, and he's hoping it's a cold. But Ballard Rural had a case last week, so who knows, you know.
We will lift up the dead. Anybody else? I meant to ask, but I guess Joey got back safe last week. No one else? Let's open up with the word of prayer, if you don't mind. Mikey, would you open?
Lord, we come to you today with humble hearts. We start off with these words that are seeking purpose. Lord, that touch them and make your touch, Lord. Give them strength, Lord, that strength comes from you, God. Just ask you to be with Carrie, on the past, Lord, we ask you to be that favor, strength, Lord, we just lift up now. Lord, we ask you to be with us as we study our lesson. Jesus walking on the water, what it means to believe in you, to depend on you, knowing that you're there every day, even though we don't realize it. And we ask you.
Well, good morning. Good morning. Good to see everybody out on this snowy, cold January morning. We've got a big jump, which I think it is about a year, between Jesus in Cana turning the water into wine and Jesus walking on water this week. There are a series of events that John records from Cana to Samaria to Judea, back to Cana. All that occurs in the time between what we read last week. Oh, and a trip to Jerusalem to the temple to clean out money changers. We have all of that occurring in this year. And what we read in chapter 6, in the first couple of verses there, is that a big crowd has started following Jesus. Last week, we had his disciples. It was just a few guys that had gone with him to the wedding. And what was Jesus' his big statement in that wedding about his display?
It is not yet my time.
It is not yet my time. Well, immediately after that wedding, he goes to the temple in chapter 2 and starts saying, this is my Father's house. And it becomes his time. It becomes his time to be shown to the world who he is. And that occurs, and that brings us, and we're going to talk about all those little things that happen tonight. I've decided that tonight we're going to go through chapters 3, 4, and 5 and talk about the events that John records that show Jesus to the world. I think those are really important events. We're going to talk about them because they're so important to today's lesson. If it wasn't for that, today's lesson wouldn't have happened. They're so critical to it. Because what happens in the first part of chapter 6 is that Jesus is surrounded by a ton of people listening to him preach who are in town because of the Passover or in the area following him. And what's the miracle that occurs in the first part of chapter 6? He feeds them. He feeds 5,000 men plus no telling how many women and children. And at the end of that event, the crowd decides what? You know what they decide?
Make him king.
We're going to make him king. So we go from Jesus at the wedding doing a small miracle with just his disciples so that they'll know, to this crowd trying to forcibly put him in charge. And Jesus goes up to a mountain to pray, and he sends the disciples across in a boat back to go toward Galilee. So that's where we are in our lesson today. And again, tonight we'll spend a few minutes talking about what gets us from point A in Cana to the 5,000 men and women and children following him, wanting to king him in our lesson today. So that's what we'll talk about tonight. So let's open up our lesson, John chapter 6, and we begin kind of in the middle of that story, verse 15. So we'll do these, let's just look at verse 15. Let's just look at one verse at a time, because it's a really short section. We're going to be done early today if we're not careful. So let's look at verse 15, and someone read that for me, please.
When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone.
How many people would have had that same response? If you've got 5 or 6 or 10,000 people wanting to make you king with the enthusiasm to do that, how many people would say, you know what, no, I'm good. I'm going to go, I'll get away from this. Notice, Jesus takes that approach. I'm not going to make any comparisons to any politics. No comparisons to politics. We're not going to do politics today. No politics. So Jesus gets away from the crowd who was wanting to make him king. And what does it say how they wanted to do it? By force. Now, could Jesus, in any way, shape, form, or fashion, and I know the answer is, been rightfully on the throne of Israel? Why not? One good answer.
Oh, I don't know that.
Wrong tribe, right?
What'd you say?
Wrong tribe? What?
Jesus was from the wrong tribe.
Wait a second. He was from the tribe of Judah. Yeah, he was from Judah. So it would have been the right tribe, but I guess it would have been the wrong.
Descendant of David will always be on the
Yeah,
throne. So.
yeah. But it would have been the wrong path, I think. I think there was another path that was closer. I've read that somewhere.
It would have been man's path instead of God's path.
Yes, it would have been man's path and not God's path. But the tribe of Judah was correct. In the house and lineage of David, it would have been all correct. But it was, I'm trying to forget it.
He is the king, so how can be the wrong
Yeah,
path?
it was man's path. That's what I was going. There was a man's path that had it picked out already, and it wasn't through him. That's why. That's what I was trying to come to. But it was, yeah.
Yeah.
I was struggling to get to that. My mind was not letting me form that sentence in my brain. So, and it was going to be having to take it by force. That was the other thing, is that it wasn't going to be a natural progression. It was going to be by force. Couldn't have done it without that. So, Jesus' response to that is to go up onto a mountain. Now, is this the only time Jesus ever goes up onto a mountain to be alone? No. He does this fairly often, right? We read where he goes up onto the mountain to pray and does several things to be alone, to have a time to be with God. So he does that as a response to this endeavor. So,
I think life is taken out of Jesus when he performs a miracle. That's the human side of it, I think.
Mary, I think
And
that's-
the divine side wants to talk to his Father about all of this. It's
Did y'all just hear what Mary said? This was some truth that everyone needs to hear.
Repeat it, please.
All right, so Mary said Jesus' man side was exhausted. Doing the miracles, leading the crowds. Physically, he was tired. This worries him. His spiritual side needs to spend time with his Father. So he goes away to the mountain to regenerate, to rejuvenate, to have that Sabbath that he needs with his dad. Is that pretty well what you said, Mary?
What we need to do.
That's what we need to wear ourselves out doing stuff good for Jesus and then take a day off. I think that's a pretty reasonable approach. So, he departed into a mountain alone. Now, what happens in verse 16? Someone read that.
And when even when that come, the disciples were found into the sea.
So at dinner time, or a little later, at dark, the disciples go down into the sea. Now, what do we read in Matthew and Luke? Jesus tells them to go get in a boat.
Yeah.
He sends them down. That's what we don't get in the John version. But he sent them down and told them to get into the boat. So in verse 17, and we're going through this quick. In verse 17, they entered into a ship and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was now dark, and Jesus was not come to them. So they're out in the ship, out in the water, and Jesus is where Jesus is, up on the mountain. Let's talk about them being apart from Jesus for a minute. What did they see? Well, we're going to talk about that tonight, all the miracles and stuff. And now they are apart from him. And something's getting ready to happen when they're apart from him that's going to cause them to be afraid. Is Jesus ever really apart from them? Is Jesus? No. Jesus has everything in control, right? Jesus has everything in control. Right?
Yes.
Jesus has everything in control, right?
Amen.
There we go. Does it seem like Jesus has everything in control? And we're going to read here in a minute that sometimes when Jesus is in control and he's walking right by us, we miss it.
We're scared.
We're scared and we see things the way we think we see them instead of the way God sees them. Think about that as we're going through this. We see things with our eyes and not always with God's eyes. Because we're going to read how the disciples, even as Jesus walked right up to them, they didn't realize it was Jesus. While he was in control, they didn't realize he was in control. So, look back this section here. There's a couple of good parts here. I don't want to miss out on page 76. Why did the multitude want to make him king? Because they thought the predicted prophet would be a political and military leader that would help them get out from under the domination of Rome. Can you blame them?
Logic. Very logical.
Absolutely logical.
Yeah.
I can't blame them a bit. Rome was an oppressive, tyrannical government. They wanted someone. They read the prophecies.
Yeah.
There were prophecies out there that said he was going to come. You read Psalm and you read Jeremiah and you read Isaiah and you read about this Messiah that's going to come. And he's going to have an iron sword and there's going to be victories. That's what they were thinking of. And I can't blame them for that. If I lived in an oppressed state all the time, I would want a deliverer. I absolutely see that. I understand it. Jesus doesn't get on to them though, does he? He just takes himself out of the equation. So, the rest of that statement. Therefore, they began talking of making Jesus their king, thinking he must be the prophesied ruler. Jesus realized he needed to get away from their crowd in order to prevent this. So this is 2 weeks in a row where we have Jesus purposely away from the crowds. In the room with the disciples and the servants as he made the water into wine. And now, at this time, leading these big crowds and getting away. Crowds can be a problem, especially for Jesus. Because, the last sentence there, their intention was to use the vast numbers gathered there to force him to accept this kingship. I don't know that I've ever heard of anything like that. that they were trying to impose something on him that they wanted, that he wasn't there to do. Think about that for a minute. They were trying to impose this rule on him. And quote there, to force him to accept the kingship. Has that occurred in history before? Where they put a kingship on somebody that didn't want it, or wasn't ready for it, or it wasn't their time?
What was the youngest man that was king of Israel?
Oh, yeah.
Josiah.
Josiah, he was an infant, yeah. I'm
Well,
asking the question because I'm struggling coming up with them in my head.
perhaps it has, but see, we never hear about those things. We hear about the people who become kings.
Yeah.
The closest thing I can think of is General Sherman post Civil War. They tried to get him to run for president, and he kept telling them no, until he finally made the Sherman statement, it's still used today. If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve.
George Washington, one of their faction that wanted to make him a king.
Yes,
Uh-huh.
there were. Thank you for
There you
reminding
go.
me of
Good
that.
point there.
I forget my American history. It's
What
just-
was that example again?
she said George Washington. There were folks that wanted to make him
Well,
king.
that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are some historical precedents of that as well. And at least those two examples did a good job of backing out of it.
So we need to start Cincinnatus, which the city of Cincinnati is named after, won and defeated the enemies of Rome, and they wanted to place him in power, and he said, no, I'm going back to be a farmer.
Oh, cool.
So he could have been the Caesar, but he declined.
So there we go. There's some great examples of that when the people try to take charge over whatever, whether rule of law or whether scriptural, spiritual prophecy trying to supplant that. They did not have the best interest of God's interest at heart. They had their own. So look at that last paragraph there on page 76. There were two problems with their intentions. Jesus had not come to be the military leader. He'd only come to do what was meant to be accomplished at that time. Jesus' purpose was not going to be thwarted by the will of these people. That's what that's saying. So, he sends the disciples to the boat goes out into the sea, and then what do we know about the Sea of Galilee? Like 700 feet or something below sea level. It's deep between these ravines, and there are high sides and walls. And what happens when the wind blows? Oh yeah, you get a cold air coming off the top, meeting the warm air down over the water, and it just creates vortices and high winds, and just at a moment's notice, anything can change from a nice day to a mess in a heartbeat. So, verses 18 and 19, who would read those?
And the sea arose. And the sea arose by reason of a great wind that blew. So when they had rowed about 5 and 20 or 30 furlongs, they see Jesus walking on the sea and drawing nigh unto the ship, and they were afraid.
So, did Jesus know that the wind was going to blow?
No way.
No way! Thank you, Mikey Adler. No way. There's no way he knew that.
Never sent them out there.
No, he wouldn't have sent him out there if he'd have known that. All right, there we go. That's the answer, right? So we have the answer. The wind blowing was all part of the plan. The wind blowing was for whom? The disciples, because they're getting ready to learn a lesson about who Jesus is. And well, true, we're going to learn about our frailties and faults as well. And to know about Jesus' commandment over the elements. Physics, science, all these things. God has all of that in his hand, and he can do whatever he wants with it, when he wants with it, for whatever purpose he has. Okay? I think of the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, landing on earth. What's the shape of the New Jerusalem?
cube.
It's a cube, right? 1,300 miles in each direction. If a cube lands on Earth, 1,300 miles cube, what's going to happen to the Earth? Well, they talk about asteroids the size of a bus, and they say it would cause a global, disaster. A cube coming down out of heaven, landing on Earth. Physics is out the window at that point, right? Physics is out the window. First, I got to thinking about that this week, thinking about Revelation and that cube.
The atmospheric drag would be huge.
Oh, it would be huge. It would be terrible.
Earth will be the same because it will be burned up with fervent heat.
Oh, true. There's nothing about it that's going to be the same. All physics is in God's hands. He's got it all in God's hands. You've seen magicians pretend to, have you seen those guys that pretend, the street performers might pretend to do things like levitate and float? If you go to Las Vegas, you see all these guys on the street, and they've got little tricks on how to do it. This is not a trick. This is not Jesus figuring out how to step on stones to make it look like he's walking across water. This is Jesus in control of the elements. Absolutely in control of them. And that's what the disciples and us are supposed to learn in this lesson. So, the sea rose, and they had gotten out, 6 miles, 5 miles, something like that, into the middle of the sea, and they're at a standstill. They're at a stop. Now, what do the other Gospels say about this event? They think Jesus is a ghost, right? He's a spirit. It doesn't say that in John, but in Matthew and Luke, they say they don't know who it is. It's a spirit. He's come. And in the other Gospels, what do we have? Peter getting out of the boat and trying to meet Jesus out there. We don't hear that in John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, it's very simple. They see Jesus walking out in the sea, and even though they see Jesus walking out in the sea, coming close to the ship, what is their response? What?
Ghost.
Well, we're afraid. It's a ghost. We're terrified. It's a natural response. I can't blame the disciples for being afraid. I was telling Carolyn earlier, there was a time when I was a kid, my dad had a little John boat, V-bow John boat. It had a little, 2.5 horse motor on the back of it. He would take it out to the river. Duh. You know what that's just not very smart. But all of us were getting ready to go fishing one day, and we were getting in the boat. We were out on the river, and here the boat's kind of, we're just kind of getting it started, and the boat, back end of the boat's kind of getting out in the water. Nothing. Okay, we're either going to die, we're going to be swept down to Cairo, something's going to happen. But this boat wouldn't start. It's kind of terrifying to be out in the water like that with nothing to. Anybody ever? Ethan's, his honeymoon. Ethan had to get rescued during their honeymoon. They were out on a little sailboat, catamaran thing, him and Jamie, and they're out in the ocean, and it flips, and they're floating out to sea. I had a friend of mine that I used to work with. He had a sailboat, and he was going to sail to Bermuda. Took off, everything crashed. He had to get rescued by, I think it was the National Guard. Floating out in the Atlantic out to sea. Terrifying things to be lost at sea, right? It's reasonable for these disciples to have that fear. What's unreasonable? Jesus walking on water. Is that unreasonable? If we're the disciples sitting there and we see that? Have we seen Jesus have a control of the elements? What did we see last week? He turned water into wine. They had seen him heal a lame man in Bethesda. They had seen him feed 5,000 people with a handful of food. They had seen revival in Samaria with the woman at the well. They had seen all these things already. Was that not enough to assuage their fear? Evidently not. How many times have we seen Jesus do remarkably amazing things and we still get terrified? We still get worried. We still cower in the boat. That we're getting ready to get to that, and that makes the fear go away, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
When Jesus interjects himself into the situation, that fear tends to go away, doesn't it? When we see Jesus. Now, did Jesus know that the storm was coming? That's on page 77, last paragraph. Of course he did. And why did he deliberately send his friends into danger? Why, the opposite is true. He was rescuing them from greater danger, the danger of being swept away by a fanatical crowd.
That's a good statement.
Wiersbe, of course, Wiersbe was the Bible answer man, right, Chris? Wasn't William Wiersbe, wasn't that it? What was
Anagram for the Bible.
Anagram, that's
Yeah,
right.
Wiersbe was Back to the Bible,
Back to the Bible, that's right.
longtime radio program.
Yeah, I knew it was one of them, I couldn't think of which one it was. Back to the Bible. So, and he passed away, it's been a while. He's been gone for a while. So Wiersbe says the greater danger was being swept along by a fanatical crowd. Do you ever feel like God put you in a position that's dangerous? Have you ever thought that it was to protect you from something worse?
I guarantee it.
Probably happens all the time, and we don't recognize it. Obviously, the disciples didn't recognize it. They didn't recognize that they were right in the palm of his hands, right where he wanted them. Right exactly where he wanted them. So, the last part of that, the crowd's determination to force Jesus into being their king was more threatening than we may realize. If adamantly resisted, they might have been ready to resort to violence to accomplish their purpose. We talked in the very beginning that they were going to do it by force. And if Jesus said no, or the disciples fought against it, that force would have been used against them, is what this author presumes. So maybe the greater threat was the crowd. And then the last paragraph in that section brings it back to us, our storms. We may relate this storm to the storms of life we all encounter. Any situation that arises beyond our control, with no apparent resolution, becomes a life storm for us. How many of our life storms are to protect us from something worse? That we're put in that situation by God to learn something, to grow, to do something, but they are there to protect us from what could have been far worse. Now, are we learning from our storms? Are we growing in the storms? Are we progressing toward Christ in our storms? Are we able to see Christ in our storms? Because at first the disciples couldn't. In the physical way, they couldn't. Terrible fear. Whatever fear the disciples might have been experiencing, it suddenly increased. You know, they had to have been saying, why did Jesus put us in this boat? Why are we in the middle of this water? Why didn't we just stay with him? Why? What would have happened if they'd have stayed with Jesus? Think about that for a second. The lesson says they could have been caught up in the crowd and had issues there. What are some of the other things that could have happened?
They stayed with Jesus. Or stayed on land.
Yeah. If they stayed safe with him, would they have really been safe? Well, Jesus could have taken care of them, obviously. But the situation was, they could have been caught up in the crowd. How did Jesus get out of it? He went up on the mountain, and then he walked on water. Were the disciples ready to do that? I don't think they were ready to take a stroll out on the Sea of Galilee, were they? Sometimes Jesus gets us out of the situation because we're not ready to do that. That we're not ready to. And what do we see in Matthew and Luke? Peter thinks he's ready to do it, and then he looks around and he finds out that he's not ready. He's absolutely incapable of doing it. So suddenly they see Jesus walking on top of the water. Mark indicates that he appeared to be passing by, but when they saw him, they were afraid because they thought he was a ghost. Again, that's in Mark. It's obvious they were not expecting Jesus to get to them and help them in that situation. I like that phrase. I recognize that phrase. But sometimes we get in these situations and we don't expect Jesus to come help us out, so we don't look for him. I think as a human race, we're very guilty of that. We're looking to figure out how to row ourselves out of the situation instead of expecting God. And that's where the disciples found themselves in. So they'd been rowing all night, right? They had been rowing and only made it 5 miles. They should have been across by now. They were still trying to do things their own way. They were frantically involved in trying to accomplish what was needed for their safety. John emphasizes how Jesus calmed their fears once they realized it was him. And that's what we're getting ready to get to, Mary, when he says who he is.
I don't know if I agree with on page 77, the paragraph you're in, or that we were in.
Okay, the top, yeah.
Yes, when it says, when we are in life storms, we often feel alone and forsaken by God. I
hope you don't.
don't feel forsaken.
I hope you don't. I hope none of us in here do, but there are those that do. I think that's what it says, is that there are either, immature Christians or non-believers. Non-believers absolutely believe they're forsaken by God. We hear it all. Where's God in the face of this? Hopefully everybody in this room realizes that God's right there beside us. That's the popularity of the footprints in the sand thing, is that when I thought I was by myself, Jesus was carrying me. Hopefully we all recognize that. So Sandra, I agree with you. I don't think the we is us we. I think that we is unbelievers and those that have a very tiny amount of faith.
James, at any one time, do we think any of the disciples said, Jesus, here, don't worry about it? Or do you think they was all scared and doing everything mankind they could do to get across that sea?
I think the latter. I don't have it, other than when Peter recognizes Jesus, we don't have anything that says anything else.
It says that they was,
Yeah. What was about the other time when Jesus calmed the storm? When they were all in the boat together.
right.
Jesus was doing what?
He was asleep.
Sleep. And they all said, what? Jesus, how can you sleep while we...
Don't you even care if it's dying?
So they were.
Yeah. I mean, that was another example, but he was in the boat with them that time.
I think this lesson teaches us exactly what Sandra said, that we shouldn't think we're alone.
Yes. This is, and I think that's what Chris was saying in the beginning. This is for us to learn that Jesus is in control. This is the message for us that he was telling his disciples that we need to get, that Jesus has us. I mean, how many times you need to hear he's got the whole world in his hands? A lot. We need to keep hearing that. It's a child song that we heard since our youth, but until we take it and actually live by it, Sandra, I think you're right. As we focus on circumstances around us, there's a lot of people that fit into that we that don't see God, that don't see God's hand or God's providence or God's control or his sovereignty over that situation. But he is.
Well, I think that even though we're in a situation and we know that he's with us, I think we still feel concerned about getting through.
Absolutely. And we take it into our own hands and we grab those oars and we try to.
You just can't help it.
I think it's a natural human response, Juliana. Absolutely. Another lesson that we should learn, that we don't learn very well. I think every one of us in here is guilty of trying to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps and figure out how to get through it ourselves instead of having just a little bit more faith.
It's hard to find balance. You can't just sit at home all day long.
No, you can't. You're right.
It's hard to find.
So there's got to be an in-between and a balance, and you got to...
They had to get in the boat. They had to get out there and start rowing. That was part of it. They had to. That was God's instruction to them. They had to be there. There's a balance. We can't just sit on our laurels and wait. But we have to understand that part of our waiting, or part of our action, is waiting. I guess that's the right thing to say. Part of our action is looking for God in the situation, expecting God in the situation. That's an action, looking for him. As we look forward to his appearing, those are things that are actions that we're supposed to be doing. These disciples seem to have gone off on the other side of that and not looked. And when he showed up, they weren't ready. They didn't see him. So, in the last paragraph in that section, before we go into the last two verses, it reminded me of Jonah. It says, when we think of the storms of life that we encounter, we must realize that sometimes they have been caused by what we have done. Was that true with Jonah? It was, wasn't it? The storms literally that he encountered in that boat were because he was running from God. That just tied in my head directly to Jonah. Is that literal storm was caused by his running away from God's call, God's command. So what did they have to do? Pitched him out of the boat. Jonah didn't walk on water, but God saved him with the big fish. In those cases, we might need to make some things right in order to calm the storm. Again, it reminds me of Jonah. It doesn't explicitly say that, but what happens when Jonah gets lifted off the boat? Storm calms, fish gets him, God takes care of it. Sometimes, however, they can come about without our ever being at fault. Do we think that the disciples were anywhere at fault in this situation? Did they deserve the storm as punishment? No. We don't have any indication that this storm was a punishment for them. What we do know is this storm was used as a lesson for them. All right? So this is where we get in trouble too. Is sometimes we look at storms in people's lives as being the punishment. They're getting what they deserve. Whereas maybe we should look at it as saying, there's a storm in that life because God's trying to tell them, to teach them something, or to draw him closer to them. Get him closer to them. Get him closer to them. Sometimes, however, they come about without our having been at fault. Just as the disciples could not make progress against the wind, so we often seem stopped in our tracks from moving ahead in life. Jesus' appearance to his disciples reminds us he is always aware of our needs. Did Jesus know everything about this situation? Yes. Yes, he did. Every bit of it. And knew what it was going to take to rescue the disciples, to help them learn a lesson about his sovereignty over the earth, and draw them closer to him. So, he saith unto them, it is I. Now, what is the direct, literal translation of that phrase, it is I? What did it say in the lesson? I am. So what is Jesus telling the disciples right there? The God that made the sea, the God that made the wind, the God that made the earth and everything in it, is walking out on the water to them right now. I am. The God that met Moses in the burning bush, that I am. And it goes, if you read the Jewish aspect, it goes into the name of God and how important that is, and how this term here Jesus uses to indicate it's me. We go back to the first chapter of John, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is Jesus explaining that to them, using this storm as a vehicle, a conduit to teach that lesson. I am. Don't be afraid. Big statement. Big statement by Jesus. Big statement for the disciples to ingest, to understand. And then verse 21. I think the terms there are funny. And then they willingly received him into the ship.
Come on in here.
Well, we'll let you in. It's okay. We'll let you. I don't think that's I don't believe that's the picture that we're supposed to get there. I think they were like
Joyfully might have been.
joyfully, excitedly.
Thankfully.
It sounds like there was, well, I'm not sure we're going to let this. Yeah. No. And what's the neat thing, according to John, that happens when Jesus gets in the ship? Two things happen, right?
They were where they were intended to be.
The storm's over and they're where they need to be. The storm is over. Immediately the ship was at the land where they were going.
Though he doesn't list it as a sign, that's no doubt a miracle.
Oh, it has to be. It absolutely has to be a miracle. And when you see the term immediately, it's not like, well, in a few minutes they rode the rest of the way because the wind. No! Immediately they were where they were supposed to go. So not only is Jesus sovereign over the waves and the wind, he's sovereign over distances and time and other things as well. Things that blow our minds when we try to think about it. Absolutely outside of our limited scope, what we think is logical, it's outside of it. That's what I like. On page 79, we'll stop there. Regarding the miracles on the sea, the miracle on the sea, William Hendrickson observes that it's really 4 miracles in one. A, Jesus walks on the sea. Without suspending the laws of gravity, he controls them in the interest of the kingdom. He controls them. What was suspending the law of gravity done?
We could have just floated.
Yes, the water, people, everything. It doesn't work. Jesus controls those laws. And why? In the interest of the kingdom, so the disciples will believe. So the disciples will follow him. B, he causes Peter to walk upon the sea. That's not in this gospel. He has control over how Peter's physical body interacts with the physical world around him. C, he reveals himself as the master of the storm. For when he enters the boat, the storm ceases. Again, Mark, Matthew, Luke. And D, he conquers even space. For when he enters the boat, it is on the shore all at once, or immediately. This is not just one miracle. This is multiple miracles wrapped into one story that shows how fully sovereign, I keep using that word because I think it's very important, sovereign Jesus is over everything. This indicates how he is over everything. And the disciples, this was for them. It's for us. But at that time, it was for them to see. Not the rest of the world at that time, not the crowds, not the people that were trying to make him king, but it was his small group of 12 disciples that followed him to see Jesus as God. And that's what John, in his overall message, is trying to tell to us, that Jesus is God, the great I Am. That's the message. What a great story. 6 verses, great story. Any thoughts before we close out and get ready for church? Neat stuff. Very neat stuff. The ideas of the names of God in the Jewish aspect are really cool. Definitely worth studying, definitely worth reading. We may hit on some of that tonight, but I really want to talk about the miracles that lead up to this and how we get to this spot in history. Any other comments before we close? In that gallery? All right, nobody else? All right, let's close out of our Sunday school time with the word of prayer. Lord, thank you for this time together. Thank you for your word. Thank you for reminding us through the story of your interaction with the disciples that you are truly sovereign over everything. There's nothing that's outside of your control. There's nothing that is outside of your scope, that's outside of your understanding. And when we don't see you, Lord, give us the faith to look for you. And, you say, when we knock, you will answer. Lord, forgive us for our lack of faith. Lord, we pray especially right now for Dr. Karen. Please give them grace and peace. Help them to rest, knowing that you are sovereign over that situation as well, and that her dad is at rest. And we thank you for that blessing. Thank you for all of us being able to look forward to it. As we go into our worship hour, Lord, I ask that you be with Glenn. Give him the words that we need to hear. Give him the strength to speak them. And give us ears that will hear. And thank you for all that. In Christ's name.